Most people remember Pontius Pilate as the man who washed his hands, a passive Roman official caught between a crowd and a conscience. Someone who tried to do the right thing, but was overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. Image has shaped 2,000 years of imagination. But the historical Pilate was not passive. Ancient sources describe a governor marked by pressure, provocation, and violence. So who was the real Pontius Pilate? The answer requires stepping outside the Gospels. It requires archaeology, Roman political history, and two Jewish writers who recorded what Rome did not. The image most people carry of Pontius Pilate comes from the Gospels. All four accounts agree on the broad outline. Jesus is brought before Pilate during Passover. Pilate questions him. He finds no basis for execution. He offers to release a prisoner, as he reportedly did at the feast. He presents Jesus alongside a man named Barabbas. The crowd chooses Barabbas. And Pilate, according to Matthew's Gospel, takes a basin of water and washes his hands before the crowd, saying he is innocent of this man's blood. Scene? The hand washing became one of the most recognizable images in Western history. It entered creeds, cathedrals, paintings, and literature. In many depictions, Pilate is almost sympathetic, a man trapped by circumstance, someone who sees through the injustice but cannot stop it. Matthew's Gospel even includes a detail in which Pilate's wife sends him a message warning him to have nothing to do with this righteous man, because she had suffered greatly in a dream over him. The Gospels present Pilate as reluctant, as conflicted, as a man whose authority is ultimately worn down by a crowd and a religious establishment. The earliest Gospel, Mark, shows Pilate yielding to crowd pressure, aware that Jesus had been handed over out of envy. Luke's account shows Pilate declaring Jesus innocent not once but 3 times before finally handing him over. In John, the exchange between Pilate and Jesus becomes almost philosophical. Pilate asks what truth is, and the narrative leaves him standing in silence. But there is another account of Pontius Pilate, one that predates much of the Gospel material in its composition. One written not by followers of Jesus, but by a Jewish philosopher who despised everything Pilate stood for. His name was Philo of Alexandria. He was a prominent Jewish intellectual living in Egypt in the 1st century. He had no theological interest in defending or condemning Jesus. But he did have a reason to write about Pilate. In a letter preserved in his work known as the Embassy to Gaius, Philo quoted what Jewish leaders reportedly threatened to expose about Pilate's record. The list is remarkable. Philo describes a governor responsible for what he calls briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, and wanton injuries, executions without trial, constantly repeated, and ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. Is not the portrait of a conflicted, reluctant judge. That is the portrait of a man who governed by fear and force, who had accumulated a record so damaging that his own subjects could use it as leverage against him. Philo was not a neutral observer. He was an advocate for Jewish rights in the Roman world, and his language was often polemical. Scholars note that his descriptions of Roman governors tend toward the severe. Even accounting for that bias, his account of Pilate stands apart from his descriptions of other officials, and it aligns, in key ways, with the account given by the most important Jewish historian of the ancient world. Josephus was a 1st century historian who had lived through the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. He wrote 2 major works, The Jewish War and the Antiquities of the Jews. And in both of them, he recorded incidents from Pilate's administration that paint a consistent picture. A governor who repeatedly provoked his subjects, who underestimated the depth of Jewish resistance, who responded to that resistance with force. Josephus describes at least 4 major confrontations under Pilate. each one revealing something different about the man, about Rome, and about the volatile province he was sent to govern. Before examining those incidents, it is worth establishing something that for centuries could only be inferred from texts. Pontius Pilate actually existed, may seem obvious. But until 1961, there was no physical artifact outside of written sources that confirmed his presence in Judea as a Roman official. In June of that year, a team of Italian archaeologists led by Antonio Frova was excavating the ancient theater at Caesarea Maritima, the Roman administrative capital of Judea on the Mediterranean coast. During the dig, they uncovered a limestone block that had been reused centuries later as part of a staircase. When they examined it, they found a partially damaged Latin inscription. Despite the damage, scholars were able to reconstruct the key lines. The text reads, in translation, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, dedicated a Tiberium to the divine Augustus. The stone is now housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Replica stands at the original site in Caesarea. It is the only known physical artifact that confirms Pilate's existence and his official title. And that title, prefect, is significant. Tacitus, writing his annals around a century after the crucifixion, refers to Pilate as a procurator. But the inscription confirms what other evidence suggested. His actual rank was prefect, a military, administrative role, not simply a civil governor. Archaeology shows a man who was not just a bureaucrat but a soldier placed in command of a restless province. Understanding Pilate requires understanding Judea itself. When Rome absorbed the region in 6 CE, it inherited one of the most difficult territories in the empire. The Jewish population had strong religious laws that directly conflicted with standard Roman administrative practice. Roman soldiers carried standards bearing the image of the emperor, standard practice everywhere else in the empire. In Judea, those images were considered idolatrous. Previous prefects had understood this. They had navigated around it. They had governed with a degree of cultural sensitivity that kept the region from erupting. Pilate arrived in 26 CE, appointed by Emperor Tiberius. He was likely in his 30s, a man who had almost certainly served in the military before receiving this appointment. He came to a province that was poor, combustible, and deeply resistant to Roman religious symbolism. And according to Josephus, within months of his arrival, he made his first serious mistake. He moved his troops from Caesarea to Jerusalem for winter quarters. And he brought the military standards with him, the ones bearing the image of the emperor. Previous governors had removed those images before entering the city. Pilate brought them in at night, quietly, without the knowledge of the population. When the people discovered what had happened, the response was immediate and massive. Josephus reports that a crowd traveled from Jerusalem all the way to Caesarea, a journey of roughly 60 miles, to petition Pilate directly. They gathered outside his residence. They remained there for 5 days, and they refused to leave. Pilate summoned them to the stadium on the 6th day, apparently prepared to address their petition. But when the crowd assembled, Pilate revealed that he had surrounded them with armed soldiers, 3 rows deep. He told them they would be killed if they did not disperse. The crowd's response, according to Josephus, was to fall on the ground together and bare their necks, declaring they would rather die than allow their laws to be violated. Pilate backed down. The standards were removed from Jerusalem and returned to Caesarea. It was not mercy that moved him. It was the recognition that a massacre of thousands of unarmed protesters would be impossible to explain to Rome. But the incident revealed something about the province he governed. These were not people who would submit quietly. And the confrontation had only just begun. The second major incident involved water. Pilate decided to improve Jerusalem's infrastructure by constructing a new aqueduct. A genuinely practical project in a city that strained under the weight of pilgrims during festivals. The engineering, later confirmed by archaeological research at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, was sophisticated. The aqueduct was built to carry water over considerable distances using cutting-edge techniques for the time. Carbon dating conducted in 2021 supports the conclusion that this was indeed Pilate's project. But Josephus reports that Pilate funded the construction using money from the temple treasury, the sacred fund known as the Korban. To the Jewish population, this was not an infrastructure improvement. It was sacrilege. The temple treasury was set apart for religious purposes. Using it to build a Roman public works project, regardless of how useful that project might be, was an act of desecration. When Pilate came to Jerusalem, crowds gathered and shouted him down. But this time, Pilate had prepared differently. He had dressed his soldiers in civilian clothing. He had placed them among the crowd, hidden, carrying concealed clubs. At a signal, they fell on the protesters. Josephus reports that many were killed and many more were injured. The crowd fled. The uprising was crushed. Josephus notes that the soldiers struck with much greater force than Pilate had ordered, a detail that suggests not mercy on Pilate's part, but loss of control. The third incident is recorded not by Josephus but by Philo. It concerns a set of golden shields that Pilate had installed in the former palace of Herod in Jerusalem. Unlike the military standards, these shields bore no image of the emperor. They were inscribed only with his name and a title. By Roman standards, this was a modest gesture of imperial loyalty. But the Jewish population understood the shields as cult objects, part of the Roman practice of emperor worship. They were placed in one of the most symbolically charged buildings in the city. Jewish leaders sent delegations to Pilate asking for the shields to be removed. Pilate refused. The leaders then appealed directly to Emperor Tiberius himself. Tiberius responded by writing to Pilate personally, rebuking him, ordering the shields removed to Caesarea. Philo preserves this episode because it explains why the Jewish leaders feared exposing Pilate's record. He feared, Philo writes, that if they went to Tiberius, they would report everything. And he knew what that report would contain. The shields incident reveals something important. By the time of the shield controversy, Pilate already had a record that he was afraid to have reviewed. The provocation was not isolated. It was part of a pattern. Scholars have debated whether Pilate was deliberately hostile to Jewish religious practice or simply incompetent. A Roman officer who kept misreading a culture he never fully understood. The ancient site Livius, drawing on both Josephus and Philo, argues that the standards incident was probably an accident rather than deliberate provocation. Pilate had brought his troops from Caesarea to Jerusalem for winter quarters. The soldiers carried standard-issue imperial images. He may not have anticipated the scale of the response, but that argument becomes harder to sustain as the incidents accumulate. By the time of the aqueduct, Pilate had already experienced the standards crisis. He had already learned how the population responded to perceived violations of their laws. He had already backed down, yet he chose to fund the aqueduct from temple funds, and he had soldiers positioned in the crowd. That is not incompetence. That is preparation for a confrontation he expected. Britannica describes Pilate as a prefect who insulted the religious sensibilities of his subjects repeatedly, provoked both Jews and Samaritans to rioting, and ultimately had to stand trial in Rome for cruelty and oppression. The picture that emerges across multiple independent sources is consistent. A man of the military, placed in a province he governed by force, rather than understanding. It was the fourth major incident that finally ended Pilate's career. And it did not involve the Jewish population at all. The Samaritans were a separate group, related to the Jews, but distinct in religion and history. They also lived under Roman rule. And in 36 CE, a religious movement arose among them centered on Mount Gerizim, the holy mountain of Samaritan tradition. A leader had appeared, claiming he knew where Moses had hidden sacred vessels somewhere on the mountain. He called on the people to gather, and a large group assembled at a village called Tirathana, at the base of the mountain. Josephus reports that many in the crowd were armed. Pilate interpreted this as a potential uprising, a threat to Roman order. He dispatched cavalry and heavy infantry. They surrounded the crowd at the village. In the battle that followed, some were killed, others fled. Pilate then had the principal leaders of the movement executed. The Samaritans sent a delegation to Lucius Vitellius, the Roman governor of Syria, Pilate's superior in the imperial hierarchy. Their complaint was direct. The crowd had not been rebels against Rome. They had gathered for a religious reason, and Pilate had killed them for it. Vitellius acted. He sent one of his own officers to take charge of Judea and ordered Pilate to return to Rome to account for his actions before Emperor Tiberius. According to Josephus, Pilate had been in the province for approximately 10 years. He departed immediately because he had no choice. But by the time he reached Rome, Tiberius was dead. The emperor had died in March of 37 CE. Pilate arrived to find that the man he was to answer to was gone. What happened next is not recorded in any surviving Roman source. His hearing may have been suspended. The case may have been quietly dropped. The historian Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, claims that Pilate eventually took his own life. But that account comes from several centuries after the events and cannot be verified. What is certain is that Pilate never returned to Judea. All of this is the backdrop against which the trial of Jesus must be understood. The Gospels present Pilate as a man trying to do justice, but overwhelmed by pressure. The historical record presents a man who had spent a decade governing through force, whose administration had been marked by violent confrontations, who in 33 CE, the approximate year of the crucifixion, was in a politically precarious position. His patron in Rome, a powerful official named Sejanus, had been executed for treason in 31 CE. Sejanus had been the prefect of the Praetorian Guard and one of the most powerful men in the empire. His fall sent shockwaves through everyone associated with him. Pilate's appointment had almost certainly been connected to Sejanus's network. After Sejanus was gone, Pilate was exposed. Every complaint, every confrontation, every overreach in Judea could now reach Tiberius without a protector to filter it. When the Jewish leaders, in John's account, tell Pilate that releasing Jesus would make him no friend of Caesar, when they invoke the emperor directly, they are using the precise leverage that Pilate could least afford to resist. The phrase, "friend of Caesar," was a technical term in Roman political culture. It described someone in good standing with the emperor. To lose that standing under Tiberius was potentially fatal. The threat was not rhetorical, it was surgical. The Gospels present Pilate as reluctant. He questions Jesus. He finds no basis for execution. He says so repeatedly in Luke's account. He attempts to release him using a Passover custom involving a prisoner amnesty, though no Roman or Jewish source outside the Gospels confirms this practice existed. He famously washes his hands, and yet he gives the order. Scholars have long debated what this portrait reveals. Some historians argue that the Gospel accounts progressively softened Pilate's culpability over time, that the earliest Gospel, Mark, shows a Pilate who yields to crowd pressure without much internal conflict, while later Gospels increasingly emphasize his hesitation and reluctance. Raymond Brown, one of the foremost New Testament scholars of the 20th century, argued that the Gospels' portrait of Pilate cannot be taken as straightforward historical narrative, given the sharp contrast with how Philo and Josephus describe him. Others argue that the contrast is not necessarily a contradiction. A man who governed with brutality for years could still, in a specific encounter, feel genuine uncertainty. Pilate had executed people without trial, according to Philo. Executing one more would not have troubled him in principle. What made this particular case different was not compassion, it was political calculation. The charge against Jesus was not primarily theological. The accusation presented to Pilate in all four gospel accounts was political. The claim was that Jesus had declared himself the King of the Jews. Under Roman law, that was sedition. A man claiming kingship over a Roman province was a direct challenge to imperial authority. Pilate could not ignore it. He could not dismiss it without appearing to tolerate insurrection. And yet the Gospels suggest he tried. He goes back and forth. He speaks with Jesus privately. He offers alternatives. He is described as increasingly uneasy. John's account frames the entire exchange as a kind of philosophical confrontation, with Pilate asking what truth is, while the man who claims to embody truth stands before him. In the end, Pilate condemns Jesus to crucifixion. The method of execution was Roman, not Jewish. The decision was Pilate's alone. Under Roman provincial law, only the prefect had the authority to order capital punishment. Whatever the political pressures, whatever the demands of the crowd, the order came from one man. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing his annals around 116 CE, includes a brief reference to the origins of the Christian movement. He describes its founder as a man called Christus, who suffered what Tacitus calls the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of Rome's procurators, Pontius Pilate. Tacitus was writing about the fire of Rome under Nero, explaining who the Christians were and where they came from. He was not interested in Pilate as a character. He mentions him in passing, as a historical fact. Scholars generally consider this passage authentic and independent of Christian sources. What makes the Tacitus reference significant is not what it says about Jesus. It is what it confirms about Pilate. A Roman historian, writing with contempt for Christianity, treats the execution by Pilate as settled fact. A piece of administrative history so unremarkable that it requires no elaboration. To Tacitus, this was simply what Roman prefects did in troubled provinces. They executed people. The stone found at Caesarea in 1961 says nothing about violence or cruelty. It records a dedication, prefect honoring the emperor with a public building. It is a portrait of Roman civic administration. Formal, measured, official. The man who carved his name in limestone wanted to be remembered as a builder, as a loyal servant of Tiberius, as a responsible governor. The other sources tell a different story. Josephus records confrontations, crowds, soldiers in civilian clothing, clubs, deaths. Philo records briberies and executions without trial. Tacitus records an execution so ordinary he notes it in a subordinate clause. Between the stone and the text stands the real Pontius Pilate, a man about whom we know more than we know about most Roman governors of Judea, and yet a man who remains, in many ways, deeply obscure. We do not know his first name. We do not know what happened to him after he left Judea. We do not know whether he ever answered for what Philo said he did. What we can say is this: the man who washed his hands in Matthew's Gospel was not the Pilate that Philo described. The reluctant judge of the Gospel narratives stands in sharp contrast to the prefect who disguised soldiers in civilian clothes and had them beat unarmed protesters. Both portraits are drawn from ancient sources. Neither can be simply dismissed. The tension between them may be the most honest thing we can say about Pontius Pilate. He was a Roman official in one of Rome's most difficult provinces, carrying out the machinery of an empire that ran on order and, when necessary, on violence. He governed for 10 years, longer than all but one of the 14 prefects Rome sent to Judea before the Jewish revolt. Longevity suggests a degree of political competence. It also means that, for 10 years, the consequences of his administration fell on the people of that land. The Apostles' Creed, one of the oldest statements of Christian faith, names only one historical figure outside of Jesus himself. Suffered under Pontius Pilate. Every person who has recited that creed for 2,000 years has spoken the name of the Roman prefect of Judea, a man born somewhere in Italy, appointed by an emperor, sent to govern a province he did not understand. His name appears in a stone at Caesarea. It appears in the writings of Josephus and Philo. It appears in Tacitus's brief, Cold Aside, and it appears in every gospel, in a scene that has haunted Western imagination ever since. Whether Pilate was a man of private doubt, or a man of calculated brutality, who performed reluctance for political reasons, is a question that archaeology and ancient texts cannot finally settle. What they can establish is that the man existed,